Sylvester Stallone quietly stepped into his own restaurant and stopped in his tracks when he heard the sound of someone crying. Years ago, he built a high-end yet welcoming restaurant in the heart of downtown Atlanta. It wasn't a flashy vanity project, it was crafted with purpose, and every detail meant something. The reclaimed wood on the walls, the jazz playlist he curated by hand, even the cornbread recipe he insisted on keeping on the menu. He personally interviewed the first round of staff, trained alongside them during those early months, and even painted the back hallway himself during a late-night burst of inspiration. This wasn't some Hollywood investment. It was a part of him. And over the years, he'd learned something about restaurants. The truth doesn't live in the dining room. It lives in the margins in the dish pits, the whispered conversations near the lockers, and the quiet fear in someone's eyes at the end of a long shift. That's why, every few months, Sylvester Stallone made a habit of visiting Southpaw, like any regular customer, unannounced, without an entourage, and with no press in tow. Just him, dressed like any other man in his 70s, jeans, a plain t-shirt, and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He didn't come to pose for photos. He came to feel the heartbeat of the place he had built. This night was no different. The moment he stepped inside, the familiar scent of smoked brisket and roasted garlic hit him. The atmosphere buzzed with energy. Servers moved gracefully between tables, balancing trays of chicken and waffles, topped with maple glaze and fried rosemary. Glasses clinked, conversations hummed, and in the background, a saxophone carried a smooth melody that wrapped around the room like warm honey. To a casual observer, everything looked perfect. He kept his head down as he passed the hostess stand. No one recognized him. That was the goal. He made his way toward the bar, but just as he was about to pull up a stool, something stopped him cold. At first, it was barely audible, a sound so faint it could have been part of the music. But as he stepped closer to the swinging kitchen doors, it grew clearer. A muffled sob. Not loud, not theatrical. The kind of crying someone does when they're trying hard not to be heard. His feet slowed. He stood near the entrance to the kitchen, just outside the staff-only zone. Through the slight opening in the doors, he caught a glimpse of a young black woman, barely out of her teens, curled inward near the prep counter. Her name tag read Ariel. Her shoulders trembled. One hand covered her face. The other gripped the edge of the stainless steel table, as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Beside her stood a young man, tall, skinny, with a nervous energy. His name tag read Marcus. He leaned in close, whispering something, his voice too low to hear, but the urgency in his posture was unmistakable. Stallone felt a pang in his chest. This wasn't normal stress. He'd worked with enough people to recognize fear. This girl wasn't just overwhelmed, she was trapped in something. He backed away slowly and returned to the bar, sliding onto the end stool. A bartender named Nate came over, smiling politely. "What can I get you?" "Water's fine," Stallone replied, offering a nod. His eyes scanned the floor. Then he saw him, the manager. Bryce Halverson, mid-40s, white, tall, with neatly combed hair, and a button-down shirt so stiff it looked like it had never seen sweat. He stood near the server station, arms folded, eyes darting across the floor like a chess player. Everything about his posture screamed authority, not earned, but demanded. Not supportive, but controlling. Minutes later, Marcus walked back out onto the floor. His face was tight, his mouth pressed in a thin line, and his hands fidgeted as he adjusted his apron. Stallone stood up and approached him near the drink station. "Hey," he said, voice low. "You got a pen I could borrow?" Marcus looked up, startled. "Yeah, sure," he said, pulling one from a nearby jar. Stallone took it, but didn't walk away. "That girl," he said, voice even. "Ariel. She okay?" Marcus hesitated. His fingers gripped the edge of the counter. "She's fine," he said too quickly. Stallone tilted his head. "She didn't look fine." The young man glanced toward the manager, who was now chatting with a hostess, still watching the floor like a hawk. After a pause, Marcus lowered his voice. "She's not fine," he admitted. "He's been keeping her after hours, no overtime, no extra pay. Says it's part of proving herself." Stallone kept his voice low. "He treat everyone like that?" Marcus shook his head. "Number only her, and a couple others. Black folks, mostly." Stallone's stomach tightened. That changed everything. Before he could respond, the air shifted. The back of his neck prickled. Bryce Halverson was walking toward them. "Everything okay here?" he asked, smiling thinly. Marcus looked down, stacking plates to appear busy. "Just helping a guest," he muttered. Stallone turned to the manager, meeting his eyes. "I needed a pen. Marcus helped me out." Bryce nodded and clapped Marcus on the shoulder a little too hard. "Let's stay focused," he said, and walked off. Stallone didn't watch him go. He was already piecing things together. Power, control, subtle threats, racial lines drawn in invisible ink. He'd seen this pattern before in gyms, on movie sets, in boardrooms. Same abuse, different uniforms. A few minutes later, Stallone stepped outside under the overhang, pretending to check his phone, though his mind was far from idle. That girl, Ariel, was in trouble. He didn't know the whole story, but he knew enough. She was scared, and someone was using their position to keep her there. That didn't sit right with him. Not here, not in a place that bore his name. As he stood in the warm Atlanta night, the door creaked open behind him. Nate, the bartender, stepped outside, lighting a cigarette and nodding politely. Stallone saw an opening. "Long night?" he asked. "Always is," Nate replied, taking a drag, "especially when Bryce is on the floor." "What's he like?" Sly asked casually. Nate looked around before answering. "Strict, controlling. Plays favorites." Stallone nodded, then asked softly, "Ariel, he single her out?" Nate paused, then exhaled slowly. "Yeah, always makes her stay late. Talks to her like she owes him something. Gives her the worst tables, the worst shifts. She don't complain, though. Just takes it." Sly's jaw tightened. "Because she's scared?" Nate nodded. "We all see it. None of us say anything." Stallone looked back toward the restaurant windows. Ariel was still inside, still working, still under that man's control. He took a deep breath. He wasn't just going to walk away. Not tonight. Not when he'd seen this too many times. Not when someone needed him to not be silent. Stallone stood outside for a long moment, the thick Georgia air pressing against his skin as the hum of the city continued all around him. His mind was turning, eyes fixed on the reflection in the window, on the soft flicker of light, the movement of staff, the familiar rhythm of service. But now, knowing what he knew, it all felt different. The shine was still there, but the soul had cracked. He couldn't ignore what he'd seen, what he'd heard. Ariel was still inside, still working under the pressure of someone who used his position not to lead, but to dominate. Stallone took a slow breath, adjusted his cap, and stepped back inside. The energy of the restaurant hadn't changed. The music still played. Customers were still laughing. Wine still flowed, but beneath it, there was something he couldn't unsee. As he moved back toward the bar, he passed Bryce, who gave him a quick, professional nod. Stallone returned it with a neutral glance, not breaking stride. He made his way discreetly through the side hallway, toward a service corridor that led to the kitchen and staff lockers. He knew the layout well. He'd walked those same halls in the early days, helping fix a broken fridge, cleaning spills, joking with the crew. Now the hallway felt colder, heavier. As he rounded the corner, he spotted Ariel again. She was working near the storage shelves, head down, folding napkins with practiced precision, her face calm but distant, like someone who had learned to hide exhaustion behind perfect service. Stallone approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. "Excuse me," he said gently, just loud enough for her to hear without drawing attention. She turned, her eyes wide, unsure. "Yes, sir," she said, her voice quiet, professional. "I know this is a little strange," he said, voice soft but clear, "but I saw you earlier, and I just wanted to check in, make sure you're okay." Ariel blinked, her mouth slightly open, unsure what to say. She looked around, clearly nervous someone might overhear. "I'm fine," she replied after a pause, almost automatically. "Thank you." "You don't have to say that," he said kindly. "I'm not here as a customer." She tilted her head slightly, confused, as if trying to place him. Stallone looked around briefly and then said, "I'm the owner of this place. My name is Sylvester Stallone." Her eyes widened. For a moment, she seemed to stop breathing. "Wait! You're him?" He gave a small smile. "Yeah, but that doesn't matter right now. What matters is you, and what I saw tonight doesn't sit right with me." Ariel looked down, her hands trembling slightly. "I can't talk about it," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "If I say anything, I could lose this job. And I need this job." Stallone nodded slowly, understanding. "I've been there," he said. "More times than you'd think. You're not alone in this." She swallowed hard, then whispered, "He only does it to me. Makes me stay late. Tells me I need to work twice as hard if I want to stay on the schedule. He doesn't say that to the others. Just me, and a couple others who look like me." Her eyes filled, but she fought back the tears. "I tried to tell someone once, but they said he's just strict. That I was lucky to even be working here. No one's lucky to be treated like they don't matter," Stallone said. "That's not how I built this place." Before they could continue, a voice rang out from behind them, calm, smooth, and far too close. "Everything all right back here?" Bryce had arrived. His eyes flicked between Stallone and Ariel, and though his tone was polite, his posture told a different story. He didn't like losing control. "Ms. Taylor, we've got tables stacking up," he said. "Please stay focused." "She's fine," Stallone said before Ariel could respond. "We were just talking." Bryce turned to him, his smile polite but tight. "I appreciate your concern, sir, but I've got things under control here." Stallone stepped forward slightly, his tone still even but firmer now. "I'm sure you think so, but I've been hearing things tonight, and I've seen enough to know something's wrong." Bryce blinked. For a brief second, his confidence faltered. "If there are concerns, I'd be happy to address them privately." "Great," Stallone said. "Let's do that. Right now." The tension in the hallway was thick. Ariel looked frozen. Bryce forced another tight smile and gestured toward his office. "After you," he said. Stallone turned to Ariel before walking away. "Stay here. This won't take long." She nodded, still in shock. Bryce's office was small, but spotless, neatly arranged binders, framed certificates on the wall, a sleek desk with nothing out of place. He closed the door behind them and turned, trying to regain control. "I have to say, Mr. Stallone, I didn't expect to see you here tonight. It's an honor, of course, but if something's been misunderstood," Stallone cut him off. "There's no misunderstanding. I've talked to the staff. I've seen the fear in that girl's eyes. I've heard about the late shifts, the threats, the way you single her out. You think I built this place so someone like you could make it toxic?" Bryce raised his hands defensively. "Sir, I assure you, I've conducted myself professionally at all times. If certain employees misinterpret firm management as—" "You don't intimidate me," Stallone snapped, "and I don't buy the rehearsed excuses." He pulled his phone from his pocket and tapped a button. A recording played. Ariel's voice, shaking. "If I say no to him, I lose my job. Then Marcus, he does this to her all the time. It's not right." The sound filled the room. Bryce paled. "I didn't know anyone was recording conversations. You should have known better than to treat people that way in the first place," Stallone said coldly. "You've made people feel small, powerless, and that ends tonight." Bryce opened his mouth to respond, but Stallone was already dialing a number. "Corporate HR," he said. "They'll handle your exit, effective immediately." "Please," Bryce said, voice cracking. "I've been with the company for—" "And now you're done," Stallone said. "Get out of my restaurant." When Stallone walked out of the office, every eye in the hallway was on him. Ariel stood near Marcus, both of them tense, unsure what had just happened. He met Ariel's eyes. "He's gone," he said simply. Her lips parted, a slow breath leaving her lungs, her shoulders beginning to ease for the first time that night. Marcus blinked, stunned. Nate, the bartender, stepped into view, and a few other staff members gathered nearby, watching. Stallone turned to face them all. "I built this place to feel like home for guests, for staff, for everyone. But somewhere along the way, something got lost, and I take responsibility for that. Starting tonight, we're going to change that. This isn't just about one bad manager. It's about making sure every single person here feels safe, seen, and respected." Ariel stepped forward, her voice trembling. What if we speak up and no one listens?" Stallone looked at her, eyes steady. "Then I'll be the one who does. You have my word." For the first time, a hint of belief flickered across her face. In that moment, the heartbeat of the restaurant shifted. Something real had returned, not just order, not just policy, but dignity. And for Stallone, that was more valuable than any review or bottom line. For a long moment, no one moved. The kitchen was quieter now, the dinner rush fading into soft clean-up sounds, clattering dishes, running water, the low murmur of end-of-shift chatter. But in the hallway outside Bryce's office, everything stood still. Ariel stood with Marcus, her hands clasped tightly in front of her apron, her eyes wide and searching. Nate leaned against the wall nearby, arms crossed, face unreadable. A few other employees had gathered too, pulled by instinct, curiosity, and something deeper, hope. Stallone looked around at all of them, then back to Ariel. "He won't be coming back," he said, "and no one else will take his place unless they believe in this place the way I do." Ariel nodded slowly, still absorbing everything. "It feels like I'm dreaming," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're not," Stallone replied. "You're just finally being seen." He turned toward the group, his tone shifting from private to purposeful. What happened here tonight isn't just about one bad man. It's about a system that let him stay too long. It's about the silence that fear creates. And that's on me, too. I should have seen this sooner. That's why I came in tonight, not for numbers, not for reviews, but for the truth. The staff exchanged glances, unsure of what came next. Marcus spoke up, his voice steady. We've been scared to speak, not just about Bryce, about everything. The hours, the pressure, how fast we're expected to move, the way some of us are treated differently. He glanced at Ariel, then at another line cook, a young Latina woman with tired eyes, then back at Stallone. It's like, if you don't just nod and smile, you're off the schedule next week. Ariel chimed in, her voice a little stronger now. I've wanted to leave so many times, but rent doesn't wait. Groceries don't wait. I thought maybe this was just the way it is in restaurants. You learn to survive, not speak. Stallone listened quietly. He had spent a lifetime around tough places, boxing gyms in Philly, film sets in the desert, hotel kitchens during his early acting days when no one knew his name. And the pattern was always the same. The powerful controlled the powerless, not always with fists, but with fear. And that fear, if left alone, spread like mold. He took a deep breath and stepped forward. We're changing that, starting now. This restaurant is under direct review, not just the manager position, but how we treat people, how we promote them, how we listen. No more favoritism, no more intimidation. If someone doesn't lead with integrity, they don't belong here, no matter how clean their shirt is. There was a murmur of agreement, soft but growing. People began to stand a little straighter. One of the prep cooks, who had never spoken much, looked up and said, "What if the next person just acts nice when you're here, but turns cold the rest of the week?" Stallone nodded, understanding the fear behind the question. That's why we'll be installing anonymous reporting, regular staff check-ins, and rotating peer evaluations. No one will ever be left alone in the dark again. Not here. Nate, the bartender, who had seen more than he'd ever said aloud, finally spoke. Does this mean someone like me could move up? I've been here 3 years. Trained people who got promoted over me because they fit the image better. Stallone met his gaze. It means if you do the work, if you lead with heart and show up with pride, there's no reason you shouldn't be behind that bar as head bartender or even general manager one day. The doors aren't just open. I'm holding them wide. Ariel let out a breath that sounded like she'd been holding it in for years. I didn't know someone like you would care about someone like me, she said, eyes glistening. They always say the people at the top don't look down unless it's to judge. Stallone walked toward her, resting a hand gently on her shoulder. I don't look down, he said. I look eye to eye. And when someone's hurting, I don't care what their title is or where they came from. If you work under my roof, you matter. The night wound down slowly. Tables were wiped, silverware sorted, lights dimmed. But something in the air had shifted. Staff who usually left in silence lingered a little longer. Some gathered around the break table with cups of coffee. Others shared stories, frustrations, dreams they hadn't dared speak aloud before. There was laughter, too, not forced, but real, the kind that only happens after a storm passes. And Stallone stayed through all of it, not giving orders, just listening, talking, being present. When it was finally time to go, he stood near the front window, watching as the last of the staff filed out. Ariel walked beside Marcus and Nate, the three of them talking softly, shoulders relaxed, steps slower than usual. They weren't rushing to get away anymore. He stood there a moment longer, alone in the quiet glow of the empty restaurant. The smell of lemon cleaner and cedar smoke lingered in the air. Outside, the streetlights flickered against the pavement. And in that stillness, Stallone reflected not just on what had happened tonight, but on how easily it could have gone unnoticed. One bad man, one scared girl. A system that looked polished on the outside, but rotted in places unseen. How many more restaurants were like this? How many more Ariels were out there, working in silence, trying to survive while no one looked? He knew now that leadership wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room or having the final say. It was about stepping in when it mattered, being a shield when someone couldn't stand on their own, and using whatever power you had to lift others, not trap them. He pulled out his phone, opened a blank note, and began typing. New policies, names he wanted to follow up with, changes to implement across all locations. This wasn't the end of a story. It was the beginning of a better one. As he stepped outside into the thick southern night, the air felt a little lighter. He wasn't walking away from a crisis. He was walking toward responsibility. And behind him, Southpaw stood quietly in the dark, not just a restaurant anymore, but a place that had been shaken awake. He glanced once more at the sign above the door, then walked into the night, knowing the real work had just begun. And somewhere inside, a young woman finally felt seen. A team finally felt heard. And a leader, after all these years, remembered exactly why he built this place. Not for fame, not for praise, but for people. Because when one voice dares to speak, it gives others the courage to rise. And sometimes, that's all it takes to break the cycle.